Give us your sense of what's going on right now over there in Ukraine. Where are we? Are we in stasis?
I really believe so. To me, this looks much like World War I. You've got this very large battle going on in Bakhmut, but it doesn't really have significance. They're making an inch at a time and losing 1,000 soldiers at a time. So at the end of the day, it's carnage, but it's not progress.
We heard overnight about the use by the Russians of so-called hypersonic missiles. I guess these can even be redirected in air and may be able to elude any sort of air defense. How important is that potentially to the balance over there?
Probably not much. I think that these are missiles that can get through the air defense systems of the Ukrainians. They could be counteracted perhaps when the Patriots get there, but I think we've got to remember that what's going on is a strategic bombing campaign on the part of the Russians who are trying to convince the people of Ukraine to give up since they can't get the soldiers of Ukraine to give up.
Mark, we've heard about a possible spring offensive by the Ukrainians. Do they need to go on the offense? Can they simply play defense?
Well, they can play defense, or they could move to more favorable defensive positions and use the next few months or perhaps the entire year to get stronger. We introduce better weapon systems such as the tanks, such as the armored vehicles, possibly fighter jets, and use that time to chew up the Russian forces even more so that when they do conduct an offensive later on, they'll be in much better shape. However, I think there is some imperative on the part, and certainly a desire on the part of Zelensky, to conduct some sort of offensive this spring to demonstrate progress, which is the only way to keep the people of Ukraine behind him and, candidly, to keep the West behind him as well.
We've heard a lot about limits and, for example, ammunition, not just weapon systems, but ammunition. Is there any limit to the Russian ability to throw men into the battle? Not necessarily trained men, not even necessarily equipped men, but still men. They keep throwing it at it. Can Ukraine win that war?
Well, that would be an inflection point, because if you start talking about the entire population of Russia possibly going into the fight, that would require a general conscription, not just bringing back reservists and bringing in prisoners working for Wagner Group. I think it really would be a sign of desperation on the part of Putin if he had to go and do a general draft of his troops. Could he do it? Sure. Could he take the casualties? Yes. They've certainly done this before in wars previous to this, but it really would be an inflection point for him as a leader and for the Russian people.
You mentioned the Wagner Group. There was a report in the press today that perhaps what's going on in Bakhmut might be a turning point for Wagner Group, one way or the other, that if they don't deliver on Bakhmut, they may actually have some real problems. Do you agree with that? How critical is the Wagner Group, and how close to a tipping point are they?
Well, they could be close to a tipping point because they are truly running out of soldiers. But it probably would not be an inflection point because they have really been the only ones that have achieved any kind of success over the past 4 or 5 months. But their success depends on a constant resupply of recruits and volunteers, and that number is drying up. But they're about the only ones that are willing to seriously fight and have done so over the wintertime. Can they continue to get more people to jump into the slaughter? We'll see. I think not.
General, Iran has played a role in this, in helping Russia, particularly with drones and other supplies coming in. Now we hear today that Saudi Arabia apparently has had something of a rapprochement with Iran, brokered evidently by President Xi in China. Could that have an effect on the conflict in Ukraine if, in fact, Iran doesn't feel quite the same pressure?
I really don't, David. Look, what Iran is getting from the Russians are more advanced weapons systems that the Russians are picking up on the battlefield. They're sending them down to Iran. They will be reverse engineered the way that they reverse engineered our TOW missiles and some of our earliest drones about 15 years ago. I actually think that is more significant because that will put more pressure on the countries in the region as Iran starts introducing far more advanced weapon systems, copycats of javelins, copycats of stingers, and that makes them actually a greater threat in the region. In my mind, this rapprochement with Saudi Arabia in the case of the Saudis, could very well be it's a matter of keeping your friends close and keeping your enemies closer.
And more broadly, Mark, if you go back to the beginning of the war, it was hoped that a lot of the world would be against Russia and what they're doing in Ukraine. If you go back to February 24, I'm not sure how many people on the sidelines have come off on the sidelines. I'm talking about India, Indonesia, certainly China. How important is the battle for the hearts and minds of the global South, I guess many people call it?
Well, this is very much like we saw in the 60s. We're seeing a beginning of a non-aligned movement, which is another way of saying we don't want to be anywhere near when the elephants are running around. So I don't necessarily think they support, nor do they not support. They just don't want to get involved, and they don't want to have to make a choice.
Do you have any doubt of the coalition remaining as intact as it has been, which is, at least to my way of thinking, quite remarkable? And for that matter, support from Capitol Hill. We hear some grumblings, but it appears that that's subsiding. Is that your impression?
On the latter point, yes. Look, Congress always has had a responsibility to approve weapon systems transfers to other countries. I think their nose is in a bit of a snit, because they have not been involved in the weapons transfers, which is their long-standing responsibility. So I'm not too concerned about that.
Okay, Mark, it's always been great.
And as regards the coalition, that's something you've got to nurture every day. That's something you can't take for granted. The president has got to stay on top of that, because if he doesn't, he'll lose it.